Changing the Narrative Around Care Leavers in Australia is a presentation given at the 13th Annual TQR, or the Qualitative Report Conference at Nova Southeastern University in Florida, USA, in January 2022. The conference title was Research for a Change, Time to Evoke, Provoke and Invoke. During the 19th and 20th centuries, around 1% of all children in Australia at any given time were separated from their families and lived in some kind of institutional kinship care, foster care or work placement. Despite widespread mistreatment, abuse and a lack of formal education in out-of-home care, care leavers, or adult survivors of out-of-home care, have proven to be tenacious and resilient, and their activism was amongst the first internationally to achieve political recognition. Yet, for generations, care leavers have battled against stigma and negative stereotyping. Our survivor-led participatory research project, Care Leaver Activism and Advocacy, From Deficit Models to Survivor Narratives, aims to A, investigate the origins of the stigma confronting many care leavers, B, examine the rise, strategies and impact of survivor-led activism, and C, disrupt deficit-driven constructions of care leavers. In this panel session, we, meaning me, Nell Musgrove and Jacqueline Wilson, talk about how we pulled together these three strands of research into a cohesive and potentially transformative project funded by the Australian Federal Government. Here I am talking about the third strand of our project, disrupting deficit-driven constructions of care leavers. My name is Dee Michelle and I have lived experience of foster care and am currently an academic based at the University of Adelaide in South Australia on Kaurna land. The third strand of our Care Leaver Activism and Advocacy project is to disrupt deficit-driven constructions of care leavers which persist despite numerous inquiries and public attention since the 1990s. To do this, we are gathering life stories of care leavers which highlight contributions to community and culture while not ignoring maltreatment and ongoing suffering. This part of the project is inspired in part by Ethiopian British Lem Sisse, who grew up in foster care and children's homes in the UK and is an award-winning poet, performer and until recently Chancellor of the University of Manchester. And that's a picture of Lem on the screen. He begins his BBC4 radio program, Lem Sisse's Origin Stories, by reciting the names of many popular fictional characters who have been in out-of-home care, for example, Harry Potter, James Bond and Superman. We do not see the connection, Sisse goes on to say, between these fictional characters and the real foster child. And he wonders if we cannot see the hidden in plain sight connections because we do not equate the children in foster care with greatness or goodness. We do not see that children in foster care use extraordinary skills to deal with extraordinary situations on a daily basis. And I've quoted from Lem Sisse there. In other words, children in state care are usually seen as super dads, not superheroes. Instead of superheroes, we wanted to write about ordinary people who have had to use extraordinary skills to survive. Between July 2018 and the formal commencement of our project in January 2021, we put together a collection of over 300 short-form biographies of care leavers, primarily from Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. All of the biographies were built from public domain material, which means that in the main, they are high profile or well-known people like 17th century mathematician Isaac Newton, American actor Marilyn Monroe, and the longest serving Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies. The data collection was via four methods. First, convenient sampling, because as a member of the international care leaver community and an academic who has worked on a history of foster care in Australia with Nell, I was aware of people like Lem Sisse and the father of art history in Australia, Bernard Smith, who grew up in foster care. Second, purposive sampling was used because others like Dr. Mike Lindsay in the United Kingdom have produced lists of famous people who have been in care. Chris Chmielewski, who runs the Foster Focus magazine in the United States, was another source. Third, a form of snowball sampling happened in two ways. One, by people knowing about the project and passing on names. And second, by reading autobiographies and biographies, which led to other people who'd been in care. For example, reading African-American writer Richard Wright's account of being in an orphanage and kinship care led to exploring poet Langston Hughes' childhood in kinship and foster care. I've never read anything about serendipitous sampling in textbooks, but it is our fourth method. Sometimes watching a television show leads to investigating a performer further. like English actor Samantha Morton of The Walking Dead fame and finding out she was in the state care system for most of her childhood. We will transfer many short-form biographies from this initial collection onto our project website. The emphasis will be on Australians, but will include non-Australians who have been influential here too, such as 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, who was in kinship care as a child and who worked in Western Australia early in his career in the mining industry. We will expand beyond public domain material for this current project and invite Australians to contribute their life stories too, which they can do in print, video and audio formats, or a member of the research team will conduct an oral history interview and, in collaboration with the interviewee, turn that interview into a short form biography for the website. To the website, we will also add historical case studies from the Contesting Long Histories of Stigma strand, and we will add biographies of survivor activists based on the Leaver Activism Participatory History strand. We already have one such activist on the website, Jim Luthi. Jim was in foster care before being sent to a Salvation Army children's home in Goulburn, New South Wales. He started his working career in hospitality, but he then went on to university and qualified as a teacher. Jim was influential in organising a formal apology from the Salvation Army in 2010 to those abused in Salvation Army homes. In addition to extending and formalising the database by connecting it with this project's wider research, this strand will use a life course perspective to examine biographies across the lifespan. For example, we will look more closely at the prevailing overrepresentation in the prison system single story by exploring biographies of Australian care leavers who have been in prison, for example, First Nations activist Vicky Roach and poet Shelton May, but for whom this wasn't the end of their stories, unlike care leaver Glenn Vallance, who in 1964 was the last man executed in South Australia. Another example is highlighting the different attitudes and expectations towards middle upper class children in informal foster and kinship care compared to those in formal state care. In my state of South Australia, our city's designer, William Light, who grew up in informal foster care, and our first premier, Boyle Travis Finnis, who was in informal kinship care as a child, are honoured with streets named after them, statues, etc., whereas children who died in state care in the 19th century were buried in unmarked graves and not even acknowledged until 2015. Similarly, when middle upper class parents were working elsewhere in the British Empire, they often sent their children home or left them in England in informal foster and kinship care. Two examples are writer Rudyard Kipling, a questionable character these days, and pioneering computer scientist Alan Turing, both of whom were expected to attend at least secondary education, whereas state children during their respective times usually received only a minimal formal education and were then sent out to work as domestic servants, labourers, factory workers. That said, the biographies also show how social movements contributed to improved life chances for some. Western Australian politician Jan McFarlane, for example, who was in an orphanage as a child, was encouraged by the second wave feminist movement to become a community development worker, and she then went to university after the Whitlam government abolished fees in 1974. The final point about the short form biographies being published on our website is that the stories will act as a form of public pedagogy, a way by which the public can be educated on who care leavers are beyond negative stereotypes. While there are occasional success stories in the media, the usual story told about people in state care is about poor outcomes, overrepresentation in the prison and homelessness populations, for example. But, and as sociologist Norbert Elias noted back in the 1960s, telling one story, the worst story about a less powerful group, is a way of stigmatising that group. It's a point made much more recently by a Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie. She tells the poignant story of being told only about the poverty of a particular family until that is all she could think about them. Their poverty was my single story of them, she says. Stigma and negative stereotyping of children and young people in out-of-home care, or what Andrew Harvey and colleagues call the omnipresent soft bigotry of low expectations, or what some in the UK call careism, continues in the 21st century. And Australians who grow up in informal care arrangements are rarely spoken of. They're almost invisible. At the moment, it is not common knowledge that 8 or 26% of Australia's 30 Prime Ministers grew up in foster and kinship care. Nor that a member of the Stolen Generations, Karen Menzies, was the first Aboriginal Australian to play for the Australian women's soccer squad, the Matildas, or that a distinguished historian and academic, Jill Rowe, was in kinship care as a child. But our aim is to change all that, to make known a diverse group of people who have demonstrated tenacity and resilience and who have made significant contributions to the Australian and international community. At the moment, we have the 4 life stories on our website that you can see behind me, but soon these 4 will be added to with all the people I've mentioned today and hundreds more. Thank you.